Welcome to a special edition of CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. On this episode, we'll discuss foreign interference in Canada and break down the implications of the NSICOP report released earlier this week. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. This is the Expert Series. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, NSICOP, released a report on foreign interference revealing serious but unnamed allegations against parliamentarians collaborating with foreign states, which has raised concerns about creating broad suspicion among MPs. The next steps involve potential legislative changes and the uncertain capability of parliamentarians to effectively investigate themselves. To discuss this report and its implications, we have with us here today Stephen Chase of the Globe and Mail, former CSIS Director and National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Dick Fadden, and CIGI Senior Fellow, Wesley Wark. We'll first turn to Mr. Chase. Stephen, thank you for joining us today. Would you be able to describe what you found most significant about the NSICOP report and explain how we got here? Our audience may recall that the issue of foreign interference really picked up about mid-year last year with the Han Dong allegations, which was later followed by the appointment of Special Rapporteur David Johnson and the Johnson Report.
Sure. The NSICOP report has a lot of pieces to it, but what really stood out for journalists who've been covering the file for a long time is the allegations about parliamentarians being traitors, about there being a group of parliamentarians who are in fact colluding with foreign powers. That is not something that has come out in the last 18 months. And I think it really puts, brings this into much more clear perspective for the average person who may be wondering what this is all about, and to learn that in fact there are people who are elected to Parliament but are in fact collaborating foreign powers. I think coming from a body appointed by the Prime Minister to study it, I think that really is alarming. There are a lot of other parts to this report. It in fact, confirms a lot of the reporting that had been out there about various aspects of foreign interference, which of course led to this suite of inquiries. Last year, of course, after the Globe and other media reported using national security sources, the Prime Minister was reluctant to call a public inquiry and instead actually said the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is well placed to do this work, to look after it, to look into it. I don't need to appoint a public inquiry. So he gave a ringing endorsement to what we call by its acronym NSICOP. And of course, that is the report that came out this week. So a body set up by the Prime Minister to conduct civilian oversight has produced a report that actually goes farther than some of the other inquiries that we've seen to date. And of course, we've had the David Johnson probe, which was a couple months long last year. Then, of course, we had the Hogue inquiry issue its first report. And, of course, we had NSIRA, another oversight body, go further only a few weeks ago. So I think that the revelations about foreign interference involving parliamentarians, I think, just brings it to a new level.
Do we know at this point what kinds of activities parliamentarians were engaged in? Are there any mechanisms to deal with this kind of behavior? And what's at stake here?
Sure. The report talks about parliamentarians, and again, it doesn't specify whether it's members of parliament or senators or both, but it talks about parliamentarians accepting money from foreign governments, which it says has been disguised to obscure its origins. It talks about parliamentarians sharing information about fellow parliamentarians, I guess about MPs or senators, to help foreign governments lobby and pressure them. And of course, sharing information about parliamentary operations so that foreign governments can also lobby and influence the outcome of those things. It talks about parliamentarians meeting with foreign intelligence officers. So it runs the gamut of the kind of thing that we would normally call treason. I invite all Canadians to read it. It's a really interesting report. And again, it is not, it's produced by members of parliament and senators themselves, an all-party group. So it's cross-party. It's not any particular group. The report also talks, one of the other themes in it, of course, is that how tardy the government has been in responding to this threat and how it's ignored previous recommendations by NSICOP. and how it's been very slow to come up with tools to fight foreign interference. And it also shines a spotlight on, I think, one of the dirty secrets of Canadian politics, which is nomination races. Nomination races, of course, are where parties choose who's going to run in a riding for their under their party banner. And of course, these things are shenanigans. They're full of hijinks, and as has been repeatedly discussed by now full reports, they are a key vulnerability for foreign interference. So it says that there should be reform of nomination races as well. That's another, I think, another aspect of this. It's worth noting this report was originally delivered to the Prime Minister in March. And so before its actual public release, the Prime Minister actually tabled the bill, C-70, which contains a suite of tools to help government fight foreign interference, including a foreign agent registry. And I'm pretty sure that the bill, C-70, which was tabled in May, was informed by this report, which of course Mr. Trudeau received in March.
So, Stephen, the report is out. What is the current state of foreign interference in Canada? And now that the report has been released, what would you say are the next steps and challenges ahead?
Well, there's a political challenge, of course, which is now the report has raised the specter of traitors in our midst. And so I think it helps, it works to further reduce the standing of politicians in the eyes of Canadians. I think it's actually quite dangerous. And so there's been a call by opposition, chiefly by the Conservatives, but supported by other opposition parties, to force the government to name names. Tell us who they are. Stand up in Parliament and tell us who they are. In the absence of that, I do think it just adds to the narrative that politicians are corrupt and out for themselves. So it's kind of an unfortunate situation where this report teases at an alarming problem, but then never really offers us any way to solve it. I'm not sure what success the Conservatives are going to have in this, or other parties. I assume there's going to be a political process, like there's going to be committees or hearings or stuff to sort of try to get to the bottom of this. The hopes of people who are looking at Canada getting tougher with foreign interference are really pinned on C-70, the legislation the government introduced in May, which of course includes a foreign influence registry, but also includes measures allowing CSIS to talk more plainly to people outside government about threats and give CSIS more tools to deal with this, and of course create a new suite of offenses that can be used to prosecute foreign interference. That would be the best thing in the short term that could be addressed. That the hope is that this bill gets passed. Now, the Conservatives, which of course is the official opposition, have said they're going to do everything they can to help expedite the passage of the bill. I still remain uncertain of whether it's going to get passed before the House rises for the summer break. And of course, the risk in the fall is that other priorities take command. So many people are looking for the government to follow this up by passing this legislation. Again, I'm not sure whether there's enough will on the part of the government to pass something before the House rises.
What would you say are the potential long-term implications if we don't adequately address foreign interference, and how might this affect our democratic institutions and our international standing with our allies?
Well, we are a small country, an open society where we've been for many decades a high trust society. We don't have a lot of surveillance. And so and in the words of CSIS, the foreign powers have determined that there are low costs and high rewards for foreign interference in this country, meaning you can get away with doing pretty much what you want, and no one's gonna end up in jail or on the front pages of the paper because no one gets caught, no one gets prosecuted, no one gets jailed. So I think that the problem is that as we see a rise in authoritarian governments who are not only more wealthy and more willing to project power, that we're simply going to become a playground for more interference from the Chinese Communist Party and countries like India and Russia. And of course, that has a real problem because it generally tends to help, I think, contribute to the narrative that politics is a waste of time and that politicians are corrupt and they're just out for themselves and so on. So I think it is linked to, I guess, faith in democracy and the faith in the process. And if we don't do anything, we're going to make it open season for these authoritarian regimes to continue to harass their former citizens who live here, and also harass and intimidate our parliamentarians. Foreign interference has entered the public debate in a way it never has before. And 18 months ago, when the Globe and Mail we began publishing stories based on national security sources and documents, the government played it down. They disputed it. They said that there was nothing to be worried about. And of course, 4 reports so far have proved them wrong. And in fact, have proven that Canada is in fact seen as an easy place to conduct foreign interference, and that there's very little cost to doing that. And I think that we've come a long way in public understanding of this in 18 months. And I guess what would be really rewarding is to see Canada take some measures to protect itself and to protect its citizens. So here's hoping that C-70 gets passed.
Thanks for joining me, Stephen. We appreciate the work you do and hope to have you on again. Next, we'll turn to Richard Fadden. Mr. Fadden, thanks for making time to be with us today. I'm wondering if you could outline the current state of foreign interference in Canada's democracy and electoral processes. What do foreign states hope to gain from this interference, and what tactics do they employ broadly?
Okay, well, let me start by suggesting a definition of foreign interference, because I think people talk about it a great deal without really giving it a great deal of thought. And from my perspective, they are efforts, some successful, some not, by a foreign state to secretly influence, by intimidation or otherwise, Canada's democratic institutions and processes. And I would note that I say Canada's, not the government of Canada, so it includes all levels. And institution and processes goes beyond elections. So to answer your question directly, I can do no better, I think, than read from the NSICOP report, which says foreign states conduct sophisticated and pervasive foreign interference, specifically targeting Canada's democratic processes and institutions involving all orders of government. So I think what NSICOP, NSRIA, and the Hug inquiry are telling us is that we have a serious problem. We have a serious problem that the government of Canada has just now begun to pay attention to in a serious way.
What were some of the key findings and recommendations of the NSICOP report from your perspective, and what are your thoughts on some of these findings? Did anything stand out to you in particular?
Well, I think the main finding was the preliminary one, which they said that there is pervasive foreign interference. The second really significant finding is that NSICOP says the government has been aware of this in a substantive way since 2018, where it did do a variety of things to try and deal with the elections component, but not a great deal to deal with other parts of foreign interference. It suggests that the legal framework that we have right now is not equipped to deal with this. It suggests that the government, generally speaking, lacks an effective approach to engage with the Canadian public, other orders of government, and Parliament. And I guess the most striking thing about the report was the detail they provided to try and give a sense of what is going on within Parliament. That there are a number of parliamentarians, and it's not clear whether they were senators or MPs, who, to use their expression, wittingly or unwittingly, are involved in foreign interference or affected by foreign interference.
So what are we supposed to make of the fact that parliamentarians were, quote unquote, semi-witting or wittingly involved in foreign interference directly? I mean, what are the implications of this?
Well, I think the main consequences are that somebody somewhere is interfering with the exercise of our democratic rights. I think it's particularly worrisome if it involves parliamentarians, because they do have a direct role in the formulation of legislation and policy. So it doesn't really matter how another state affects our sovereignty. It's serious. I think one of the ways that these sorts of things can be dealt with is that we can find a way to talk about them more directly. You will be aware that there's been a great deal of controversy in the House of Commons over the last couple of days over the government's refusal to provide the names of those parliamentarians that have been mentioned in the NSICOP report, but which were removed from the version that was given to the Prime Minister. So we have a problem here because under our constitutional system, parliamentarians, generally speaking, don't receive classified information. But it seems to me that this is serious enough that they need to do something in order to get a grip on this problem. You'll be aware that one of the solutions suggested by the government is that party leaders should seek security clearances and then be briefed. Everybody has done this or will do this except the leader of the opposition, who claims that this will muzzle him. I would argue that the national interest here is so important that he should consent to being somewhat restrictive in what he can say over the next little while. But the idea is that if party leaders can receive this kind of information, they can then decide within their party processes whether or not a particular individual should be a member of his caucus, whether or not this individual should be allowed to stand as a candidate in the next elections. So to some degree, it's saying, I think, that law enforcement doesn't necessarily have to be involved to deal with these cases. And in fact, I would argue that the involvement of law enforcement is quite difficult because there's no crime right now in Canada of foreign interference. So the government simply saying it's over to law enforcement, I think, is a bit disingenuous.
Could you explain the weaknesses in Canada's approach to addressing foreign interference thus far? How can we address it in the short term? And on top of that, Dick, why is Canada seen as such a permissive place to conduct foreign interference activities?
That, I think, is the critical question of the day. Because, as the NSICOP report says, the government has been aware of these problems, at least since 2018, and they've been aware before then. I mean, all governments prioritize, what they're going to do and how they're going to deal with issues. It seems to me that the priority that they've afforded to foreign interference is quite low. And you'll be aware, of course, that subsequent to the Prime Minister receiving the NSICOP report, 2 or 3 days ago, they tabled Bill C-70, which does deal with some of these issues. So I think on the one hand, part of the issue is the government simply hasn't prioritized dealing with this issue. There has been the problem from their perspective of dealing with the significant national security leaks some months ago, and then deciding what attention they're going to be given to intelligence and whether or not intelligence alone is sufficient for them to take action. But it seems to me that the really significant issue is they have not prioritized dealing with foreign interference. Their response to NSICOP C-70 goes some distance towards dealing with this issue. Among other things, it will allow CSIS to discuss classified information much, much more readily. And it provides for the creation of a foreign agents registry and the creation of a commissioner's position to deal with these issues. And most importantly, I think, it makes it a crime to interfere with Canada's democratic processes in a secret manner. So they have moved recently to deal with these issues, but I can't help but thinking that they were sort of pushed through that door by the report, which was given to the Prime Minister in March or April of this year.
Well, thanks, Mr. Fadden. My last question for you would be, now that the report has been released, what comes next?
Well, I think the next step and the most important one will be for the House and eventually the Senate to pass C-70, which is titled something along the line, the Foreign Interference Act. I think that they need to get this through relatively quickly, because if they do not, its provisions will not be in place in time for the next federal election, and we don't know exactly when that will be. Most people expect it to be sometime in 25. But if we take foreign interference seriously, this statute needs to get on the books. And the second part is there's a whole bunch of things here that are going to require implementation by the public service. CSIS is going to have to sort out how it shares information with the public, not with the public so much, but with various institutions. The Foreign Interference Commissioner is going to have to be appointed and get his or her staff organized. And I think more broadly, political parties, all of them, are going to have to take more seriously the challenge of dealing with foreign interference. Whether or not the legislation applies in detail to the nomination process and all of that, I think party leaders in particular would not be fulfilling their duty of due diligence if they don't take more care than they have in the past. And I think if they don't, it will become very apparent. And the thing that worries me the most about this, as opposed to, distinct instances of foreign interference, is, you have the NSCOP report, the Hug report, the NSRIA report, and admissions by the Prime Minister that foreign interference is serious. If something concrete is not seen to be done, in the relatively short term, I think the public's confidence and trust in our political institution is going to suffer. That is not good for democracy, and we need to make sure that something is in fact done.
Thanks again for joining the CDA today, Dick. Glad to have you on. Before we close out today's episode, we'll turn to Wesley Wark. Wesley, good to have you back on the program today. Always good to see you. I'll pose the same question to you that I posed to Mr. Fadden earlier. I'm wondering if you could outline the current state of foreign interference in Canada's democracy and our electoral processes, and what do foreign states hope to gain from this interference?
I guess the first thing to be said about this is that the Canadian security and intelligence community has for a number of years identified foreign interference, targeting elections, targeting democratic processes, foreign interference more broadly in terms of other methods as a persistent threat. There has been some interesting material revealed to suggest that CSIS believes, at least in briefing notes it's prepared for various meetings, that it amounts to what it calls an existential threat, which in my view is a bit of exaggerated language, but nevertheless, a persistent threat. Various public reports that have been issued by organizations like CSIS and CSE have identified some of the main actors. There's been a lot of attention, of course, to China. The earlier concerns, really focused on Russia, dating from the experience of Russian interference in the US presidential election in 2016. And that certainly started the ball rolling for Canada in terms of trying to kind of beef up some of its resources and responses to foreign interference. But it is clear from all kinds of reporting that we've seen in the public domain that China is regarded as the number one foreign state actor involved in foreign interference around the world, including in Canada. And interesting information has been revealed more recently, including in the report from the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians about various activities on the part of the Indian state to engage in foreign interference in Canada. And the NSICOP report, as it's called, actually identifies India as the number 2 perpetrator of foreign interference, China being at the top of the list. So the question of, so we know that this is an ongoing threat to Canada. Canada is not unique in terms of being a target of foreign interference. And we have a clear idea of some of the key actors involved in these kinds of activities. The question of why foreign states engage in foreign interference, I think is, we don't know the sort of detailed answer to that in terms of any official documentation from states like China and India, but I think we can understand the broad outlines of it. And part of the reason why Canada is targeted by these countries is we are a society built on immigration. We have large diaspora communities. And those diaspora communities represent for states like China, India, an opportunity for exploitation in a couple of ways. And one way is that, and this is particularly true of China, China has an official view that perhaps Canadians don't fully appreciate, but that official view is that when a person leaves China, their country of birth, and goes abroad to live abroad permanently or even temporarily, in the Chinese official view, the Chinese state official view, that person, even if that person takes up permanent residence or becomes a citizen of a foreign country, that person remains Chinese. And therefore subject to Chinese law, subject to Chinese interests, a person that, individually and collectively in terms of a diaspora community, a person and community that the Chinese state remains interested in monitoring for a couple of reasons. One, to kind of assess diaspora politics and see whether there are elements within a diaspora community in a country like Canada that are advocating for policies that the Chinese government regards as dangerous to its national interest. You know, there's the very famous reference to the 5 poisons, the kind of key concerns that China has, including around advocacy for Hong Kong democracy, advocacy for Taiwanese independence, and so on and so forth. So they've identified a political agenda. They're on the watch for that political agenda and advocacy movements in foreign countries like Canada, and they use foreign interference to try and suppress, damp down those kinds of advocacy positions. So that's a direct form of foreign interference. But they also, want to reach into diaspora communities to see in another form of exploitation whether they can identify elements within those communities who will be supportive of China's positions, supportive of Chinese policies, perhaps able to advance a Chinese interest in terms of the political connections they may have. So that's where we get to the question of interference or influence operations targeting, for example, federal MPs or senators. It'll be part of that Chinese approach to see if they can exploit diaspora communities to engage with the political leadership in Canada to advance their own interests. Same, I think, would be said of India on those 2 dimensions, both trying to monitor the advocacy positions of diaspora communities. And for India, they're very concerned, of course, about the Khalistani separatist movement among Sikh Canadians who live in Canada, and as well to use interference operations to see if they can identify people, including politicians, who would support India's position on foreign policy or domestic issues.
What about the report stood out to you, and what were the big takeaways in your estimation?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 main headlines, if you like, Josh, in the NSICOP report. It's a long report. It's very hard hitting. It is a very substantive report. The 2 main headlines are these, and one of them the government has attempted to push back a bit against. It doesn't like the message for obvious reasons. So that headline is simply that the government, and they're talking, of course, about the Trudeau government, which has been in office since 2015, the government has been too slow to respond to the foreign interference threat. And they say that very explicitly. And it's important to remember that this is a message that's coming from a committee that consists of representatives of all the political parties, plus 3 senators. So there are 4 Liberal MPs who sit on this committee. When the NSICOP prepares reports, it's done on a consensual basis. So there's, that you don't have a main text and dissenting opinions as you sometimes see in other systems. So it's a consensual view. It's a remarkable kind of all-party suggestion, very strongly worded, that the government just has not taken these issues seriously enough. And NSICOP has its own history with this, in the sense, Josh, that it produced an early report in 2019 on foreign interference, which made a number of fairly concrete recommendations about how it thought the government could strengthen its response to foreign interference, and very few of those recommendations were taken up at the time. So it has this history kind of baked into its approach to this, and it's essentially repeating the message from 2019 with a lot more evidence available to it about things that have unfolded since that time. So headline number 1, government too slow to respond, not sufficiently appreciative of the gravity of the threat, another piece of language that the report uses. The second headline, and the one that really has, I think, generated a lot of media attention and created a lot of angst, and will probably be an ongoing story, is the information that came to NSICOP through classified intelligence that it has access to, that identified in some very specific instances that there were political actors at the federal level, MPs, senators, possibly political staffers, who had become what they call witting accomplices of foreign states, China and India both. And probably the most striking illustration of this that the committee talks about in its report and the details are redacted, so we don't get the names, we don't get the kind of context at all here. But there is one really striking illustration of this problem, that there are what the committee calls a handful of federal political actors who have been willing to work with foreign states and advance their interests. The most striking example of this is an unnamed former MP who was engaging with an intelligence officer for a foreign state, attempted to set up a meeting abroad with that intelligence officer, and had been identified as passing classified information to that officer. And when I looked at this and wrote on it myself, and in the kind of initial reaction to the report, I called this what I thought it was, which is, straight out treason. And it's a remarkable thing to hear about any, Canadian MP that they would go to that length.
What would you say are the implications of the revelation that some unnamed parliamentarians have been involved directly in foreign interference operations?
Well, it's a problem that no government or no opposition party might be implicated as well. And there's indications that the Conservative Party, for example, was a target of foreign interference, not just the Liberals. It's a problem that no government, no political party can afford to ignore. It's not necessarily an easy one to address. The government response to the question of, well, what are you going to do about this? The government response is basically to say a couple of things. One, from Minister Freeland, that the government intends an internal review. We haven't heard any more details about that, and would that be an internal review that only focused on the Liberal Party as the party in power? The other thing that we've heard from Minister LeBlanc, the Minister of Public Safety, who is in charge of many of these files from the government side, is that he has confidence in security agencies and law enforcement agencies that they will pursue their investigations. And so I think really what this puts a spotlight on, Josh, is the ability of CSIS and the RCMP to cooperate as they do their investigations, share information, and especially the ability of the RCMP to launch serious investigations and perhaps bring criminal charges. We have not seen, since foreign interference became a kind of top level national security issue, say from 2016 on, we have not seen any charges laid against political actors for foreign interference, although there are sanctions on the books. It has to be said, just as a side note to this, that the government has introduced, has tabled legislation which is moving very quickly through Parliament, called Bill C-70, which includes kind of beefed up legislative measures, including the Security of Information Act, to allow a more targeted criminalization of foreign interference. So internal review from the government, promise, don't know the details, suggestion that the security and intelligence and law enforcement agencies are on this and investigating, but of course that cannot be talked about either. Opposition parties, as you'll know, particularly the Conservatives, have been demanding that the names of these people be released. I think that's a bit of political theater, to be honest. The names are not going to be released, and I think we would have to wonder about the democratic principles behind kind of naming and shaming in that sort of way. So until we get a prosecution, we won't see the names. But I think in a broader context, what some of these allegations reveal is the need really for political parties in their own right to be able to better self-police, better appreciate themselves, the nature of the foreign interference threat, think about what they're going to do, for example, about nomination contests. And there is a suggestion in the NSICOP report that nomination contests should be brought under some kind of legal umbrella, Canada Elections Act or something, so that any tampering in a nomination contest would clearly be subject to some kind of criminal sanction, which it isn't at the moment. But there's a lot of work to be done on the political party side, a lot of work to be done on the government side.
Thanks for joining us today, Mr. Wark. Always glad to have you on the program. That's all for today's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned for the Geopolitical Update podcast every Friday, hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.